Hello, and welcome back to the Gateways Musical Podcast. This is Gateways number 13, and today I'm going to be going over a couple of requests that I've gotten over the past few days from you guys. So, let's get started. So I know that one of the big requests that I've gotten is to talk about musical links between cultures and like understanding different genres. This was requested by two different people. And I know why these two people requested it. It's because where I am right now in my music class, alongside these people, we're starting something called the Musical Links Investigation. And what the Musical Links Investigation is it's comparing two distinct musical cultures and identifying links between, their musical culture through the comparison of two pieces. And these links can be, anything you find within the two pieces that is related to one another. But you have to make sure that the piece that you've chosen is, it's like an actual representation of that musical culture. Like I know one of the big mistakes that someone made was they compared British rock music from the 60s to a lot of like some of the regional Indian music, but the problem was they compared the Beatles to this regional Indian music, and they compared it a Beatles song that was made after they visited India. So of course they scored horribly because of that, because in reality they were comparing a musical culture which had been directly influenced, like the Beatles was directly influenced by India, and they also aren't really like the standard for British rock, so they can't be compared, because one of the other big things is the cultures need to have next to no like interaction with one another, and you're just identifying links between cultures that are like vastly different. I know that one of the ones I'm looking into right now is the comparison of Buddhist chant in, I believe, 7th century Japan, and Gregorian chant in medieval Europe at around like 3rd-ish century. And the reason why I'm comparing those two is one, like this is a time when those two cultures hadn't really interacted with one another. This was before like globalization took hold, so they can be easily compared. And then also, they're both like they're both related to like a religious practice. So I want to see if there are any interesting links I could find because of that, and there actually are, which is really interesting. But the questions that I've been asked by these two people is mainly like, one, how do you decide what musical cultures and genres you want to compare? And then two, like, how do you actually compare them? Well, to start off, when you're like trying to figure out what musical genre you want to do for something like this, or just generally, like this is good general advice too, you should listen to a lot of different music. What I mean by that is like, if you like a specific kind of music, well, stop listening to that music for a while and go listen to something like vastly different, and then just keep doing that over and over again, because you never know what kind of stuff you'll find and you'll end up enjoying. Like, for me personally, I remember that there were kind of two musical genres that I stuck with for a good few years, and that was alternative music and like punk rock. And I basically that was my musical taste for about 2 or 3 years, and then I was like, you know what, I'm gonna listen to something else. And that partially became because of my jazz teacher. And so I started listening to some jazz, and I was like, okay, I like this. So I was listening to a lot of jazz, and then because of that I started listening to some of the things that influenced jazz, like ragtime. That was really cool to listen to. I started kind of branching out And then I started also listening to stuff that like was kind of created by jazz. As a result, like you have your funk, you have your blues, you have like original rock, not like punk rock or anything, but rock, like rock and roll. And kept expanding off of that. But then I got in another point where I was like, oh, I'm kind of only listening to jazz, and I always kept on telling myself that I didn't like classical music, like Western art music. Turns out that was wrong too, because when I actually started listening to some Western art music, I was like, huh, this sounds pretty nice. And then, we have that whole process of like enjoying classical music. And then you have like, I've never been the biggest fan of like rap or hip hop music, just because of the stuff that's on the modern day radio, and it's honestly like it's really bad. And I'm sorry if you disagree or whatever, but in my opinion, modern day rap songs are not good. They're definitely not as good as old school rap songs used to be, because a lot of modern day rap, it's very melodically dry, it's very harmonically dry, it's even very rhythmically dry, and rhythm is like the whole thing it's based around. Like, it's just, I think it's kind of disappointing, because, rap used to be so much more than it is now. Now it's just another way to get a quick buck for a lot of people. So it's like, it's not good. It's corporate music. It's disappointing. But I started listening to some older rap and hip hop music from like the 90s. Oh, that was good. If you haven't, recommend you listen to like Jay Dilla, the Notorious B.I.G. Listen to hold up, Beastie Boys. Listen to the Beastie Boys. They're good. Anyway, so like my personal musical like culture understanding just came from listening to a lot of different types of music over the years. So like I would kind of learn about each one, kind of where it came from, whatever. And the first thing you should probably do if you want to get into the process of like understanding musical culture is like, one, if you're using Western harmony and like Western theory, then you need to learn the like progression of Western art music throughout the different eras, because there are a lot of different eras. It's not just classical music, right? That's something to keep in mind, is that calling it classical music is wrong, because there's a classical era, right? Like there's like the Romantic era, you have the Baroque era. There are a lot, and I think let me see if I can remember the order. It's medieval, you have the Renaissance, you have Baroque, you have classical, you have Romantic, and then you have modern, which is like modern day. And then like the progression from medieval to modern, it's like it gets more harmonically rich over time. That's very important. And there are a lot more like techniques invented. There's the introduction of a lot of new instrumentation and all that jazz, right? Speaking of which, it helps birth jazz. So you have the mixture of like Western art music with sub-Saharan African rhythm. When you have the transition of immigrants to the U.S., that's kind of where that's where jazz started picking up, and it kind of started with ragtime, and then progressed from there to like all the new stuff. Actually, at the same time as ragtime, you kind of had a form of the blues, which was this was kind of closer to the end of the Civil War. So the Civil War had ended at this point, and a lot of the time, like a lot of the African American people would sing solo music over like an acoustic guitar, or at least what they had at the time. And that kind of became like one of the foundations for blues, was that style of music. Anyway, what you notice here is that like I've come to learn all these different styles of music just from listening to them. Because if you listen to them, then you can start to pick up like all these musical links that you want to have for something like the musical links investigation. And at the same time, you can learn like, you know, about how the different cultures influence each other, which that's something you need to understand if you're going to try to compare two musical cultures that haven't influenced each other, because you have to know like have they or have they not influenced each other in virtually any way. Like I remember one of these two people had asked me if they could compare like funk, so like 70s, 80s jazz funk music to Latin American music in their thing. And I was like, you can't. And they were like, well, why can't I compare these two things? And I was like, well, it's because you have the transition from Latin America. You have like the bossa nova sound, which is a part of jazz, right? Bossa nova is a subgenre of jazz, and it has very specific rhythms and like interesting harmonies. If you want an example, Girl from Ipanema, that's a bossa nova song. Another example, if any of you have played any Animal Crossing ever, a lot of those songs are bossa nova, right? So anyway, I'm like, you can't compare those because bossa nova influenced funk a little bit. And he's like, how do you know? And I'm like, well, because like, one, bossa nova came up before funk, and two, like, because they were both played in the United States a lot, there's like no way that they didn't influence each other in some way, and you can't really make the claim that they didn't. So he was like, okay, now, like, with my example, I thought, let's go back in time, because the further back in time you are, the less the cultures have interacted, because this is before, like, the era of globalization and whatever. Like, if I were to take my example to the modern day, comparing, like, Western art music to Japanese music, well, you'd end up with, I couldn't compare them, because as a result of U.S. occupation in Japan during World War II and after World War II, you have a lot of influence of American jazz on Japanese pop and, alternative music. A good example of this, there's an Adam Ely video talking all about it, how much jazz has influenced Japanese pop music. So I couldn't compare those two because there was a cultural interaction that was very prevalent, right? But I can compare 7th century Japan to 3rd century Europe, because this was way before like they even really started to interact with one another. So yeah, that's what I'm getting at, is that if you really want to do a comparison of like two distinct musical cultures, you gotta listen to the music, one, you gotta know the history, two, and you have to know the influences, three, right? It's kind of like the 3-step process. You listen to it to understand the links, you research its history to understand like its location, and then you discover its influences so that you can make sure that the cultures aren't related. So that's the whole, like, that's how you would end up doing something like the musical links investigation. And you can apply this to more than just the musical links investigation, because like the comparison of musical genres and seeing how different cultures have influenced one another is pretty interesting, and it allows you to expand your like, song palette. It could get you interested in some pretty interesting music, and then that music could influence how you make music, and it could make your music better. It could like you could have that one technique that you'd never know about that it turns out you'd love just because you never listened to a genre of music because you're like, oh, that's not my thing. Just give it a shot, see what happens. It's very good to try to expand your sonic palette, listening to different kinds of music. At least I think so. Like, if you're a big fan of like alternative rock, listen to some jazz fusion. If you're a big fan of like rap, listen to like, I don't know, folk songs. If you're a big fan of R&B, go listen to like ragtime. If you're a big fan of like that sweet jazz, then go listen to its older brothers, Western classical, Western art music, and some of the African rhythms. Go look into the musical culture of Asia. Despite what people say about it, there are some pretty interesting things out there. Just kind of generally go out and explore the world of music. There's a lot out there. And then the other thing that I got a question about was, are we going to be covering like melody? And yeah, we will. It's going to be after the rhythm section, which is going to be over soon. But that's all I have for today. And hope you're all doing well. Good morning, evening, night, wherever you are in the world. And thanks for tuning in.